Let's talk about Exodus 21. I'm going to assume that if you are watching this video, you have probably watched at least some of the earlier videos in the Exodus series. You have probably read up to this point in Exodus, so you basically know what is going on. So I'm just going to pick right up where we left off last time. The Lord has brought the Israelites out into the wilderness. They are headed for the promised land, and the Lord is delivering the law. Last week we talked about the 10 commandments. We talked about the way that when the Lord gave them the law, what he was doing was he was giving them something that would slowly, over years and years, over generations and generations, teach them how to reflect his goodness and his glory as his people. The law exists for a number of things, and we're going to break them down in depth together. At the very core, you could say that the law was about getting the Egypt out of Israel, right? God got Israel out of Egypt in the Exodus. Now he is getting the Egypt out Israel. He is unlearning all of the wicked, unjust, idolatrous ways that they were taught during their years under pagan rule, pagan indoctrination. And instead, he is teaching them, he is causing them to relearn what it means to be the people of a God who is all good, all powerful, all knowing. So the law exists to teach God's people who he is, what he is like, what he wants for us and from us. The law exists to teach us his will and his ways. The law exists to teach us how to create a community, to create a culture as his people that reflects his goodness and his glory. That is not the only thing that the law does. We will talk about the other purposes and functions of the law more throughout Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but that's the big thing we need to know for now. So much of what is confusing about the Old Testament law starts to make sense when we realize that the point was to teach the Israelites how to reflect God's character to the surrounding pagan nations in a way that they could understand, in a way that would make sense to the ancient Near Eastern culture they existed in. And so the law is not meant to make sense to our mindset. The law was meant to make sense to the mindset of the ancient Near Easterners that God is dealing with here in the rescued Israelites. And so after he's laid down the 10 commandments, kind of the heart of his law, he then goes on in the coming chapters, the entire rest of the book of Exodus, to expand upon those 10 commandments. The 10 commandments are kind of like the nucleus. They're like the heart. It's like the heart, but this is like the rest of the body. Everything else kind of flows out from the core that we find in those 10 commandments. But every other command that we find throughout the rest of the Old Testament law is also an expression of the same core basic ideas, principles, values that the Lord models for us in the 10 commandments themselves. So let's dive specifically into Exodus 21. First thing I need to point out is that the laws that the Lord is giving here in Exodus 21 are something called case laws. If you're reading like a really scholarly tome or something like that, they might call them casuistic laws. You don't need to remember those vocab words. All you need to know is that case laws essentially deal with case in points, specific cases, unique cases. Basically what they do is they deal with complicated situations where the 10 commandments themselves are just not specific enough to deal with this very specific, very unique, very weird type of situation. You could say the 10 commandments deal with God's heart, God's desires, God's will and ways in big picture general terms and kind of the 10,000 foot view terms, and these case laws throughout the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy deal with how you apply these big principles and values found in the Ten Commandments to all the really weird nitty-gritty type situations you will deal with. They basically teach by saying, if blank, then blank. If this happens, then do this. If this happens, then do that. If these things happen, then do these things. If those things happen, then do those things. They use examples. The point here is that these examples are meant to kind of teach us how to think about God's will for different situations that aren't necessarily listed here. So once we've read all of the different case laws that are found throughout Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, what should happen is that it has kind of taught us a general sort of way of thinking. This is a general kind of pattern of thinking that, generally speaking, God wants us to deal with these types of problems in this type of way, with these types of situations, with this type of solution, these types of rebellion, with this type of response, and so on and so forth. The way Exodus 21:1 puts it is, these are the ordinances that you will set before them. So you're going to set this long list of ordinances before the people, and these ordinances are going to teach the people how to think about all these different situations the way that God would think of these situations within the limits of what they are capable of understanding as ancient Near Eastern people. So these are things that are meant to make sense within the limits of their culture, the limits of their understanding, the limits of their upbringing, and so on and so forth. But there's some really important things that we should notice about these case laws. Like I said before, so many of these laws throughout Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy strike us as so strange, so bizarre. We have such a hard time even beginning to understand why God would command these different things, but they start to become a little bit more understandable when we start to recognize kind of the big pattern that they're weaving. And one of the first things we ought to notice in the pattern they are weaving is that these case laws treat everyone equally. So the laws of the ancient pagan nations had basically no sense of equality between different types of people, between different classes of people, between different tribes of people, between different bloodlines of people. Everything was arranged into a really rigid social hierarchy. There was the rich and there was the poor. There was the powerful and there was the powerless. There was the big and there was the small. There was the kind of noble, important families, and there was the unimportant throwaway families who didn't really matter. You could do whatever you needed. There were people who were born to be slaves, and there were people who were born to be rulers, born to be masters. There were people who were born to be bossed around, and there were people born to be the ones bossing everybody else around, and on and on and on. Everyone was born into some position in a really fixed hierarchy. That is the way that ancient Near Eastern pagan culture looked at everything. And yet, that is not the way that the law God gives to his people looks at things. Instead, this law treats everyone equally. In the ancient pagan cultures, there was typically one set of rules for the rich, another set of rules for the poor, one set of rules for the powerful, another set of rules for the powerless. But in the Old Testament law, everyone is subject to the same rules, the same right and wrong, the same good and bad. The rich can be executed just like the poor. Men will be punished for sexual sin just like women. Native-born Israelites will be punished for crimes just like foreign-born sojourners or immigrants or other things like that. It's really kind of the first really big, really clear example of a system where everyone is held accountable in a more or less equal way. Another pattern that we ought to notice is that sometimes the punishments seem very harsh. Now, actually, Ironically, the punishments found in the Mosaic Law are, for the most part, a whole lot less harsh, a lot less brutal, a lot less violent than the punishments and disciplines that you find in a lot of the ancient pagan law codes. This is one of the gentlest law codes you will find anywhere in the ancient. That doesn't change the fact that it is significantly harsher than most modern Western systems. That's a fact. The Mosaic Law had really harsh punishments because it needed to have really harsh punishments. It's not that God is harsh, and it's not just that ancient Near Easterners were harsh. The Mosaic Law has really harsh punishments because it was desperately important to establish order and compliance among the ancient Israelites in the immediate years after the Exodus. It was really important to establish order, consistency, when the new nation was still fragile and unstable. And as a result, you get things like verse 12, one who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. You get things like verse 17, whoever curses his father or mother shall surely be to death. This seems very harsh to us, and yet it was unbelievably important to establish order in this newly planted nation, or else it would have fallen apart. It would have died on the vine. And another really important pattern that we need to notice is that during this period, God allows a lot of things that run counter to his big picture will. Case in point, God continues to allow slavery in the Old Testament law. He heavily regulates slavery. He makes slavery vastly more manageable for slaves, more humane than in any of the surrounding pagan nations, but he still allows slavery, even though slavery is fundamentally counter to God's created order. The Old Testament law still allows forced marriage, even though in the big picture, that is fundamentally contrary to God's created order. But God allows things like this in the Old Testament law because it would straight up not have been possible to completely change the entire mindset of the ancient Near Eastern Israelites overnight. If God suddenly said, there is no more slavery, everyone is free, you cannot ever have any slaves, period, that flat out just would not have been possible for them to compute. They straight up wouldn't have had the mental hardware to even grasp it. In the same way, if suddenly he just said, okay, women are equal in the eyes of the law with exactly the same rights as men, with exactly the same privileges, exactly the same freedoms, exactly the same everything as men, it just flat out would not even have computed. It would literally not have been possible to do that without literally reaching up every single Israelite's back and maneuvering them like a sock puppet, completely taking away their will. God would have had to have turned all the Israelites into robots in order to overnight purge them of all of these bad cultural assumptions that they would have grown up and inherited with. And yet, even with all of these patterns in mind, what we see in the Old Testament law is remarkable. Here's just kind of breaking down some of the big ones here in chapter 21, and then we'll continue on and do the coming chapters. Big thing we ought to notice is the way that the Mosaic law deals with slavery. See, in the ancient Near East, one bad harvest could put you into crushing debt. You would eventually have to sell yourself or your whole family into slavery, and as a result, at any given time in the ancient world, the majority of the ancient Near Eastern population may be enslaved. Slavery was the cornerstone of ancient subsistence societies. And yet, within that context, God does a few things in the Mosaic Law. Number one, the Mosaic Law ends permanent involuntary slavery. There is a 6-year limit on any form of involuntary slavery. Verse 2 says, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free without paying anything. Number 2, in the Mosaic law, temporary servitude pays off all of your debts. Same thing, verse 2, it says, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, then he shall go out for free without paying anything. Whatever he owes you, you cannot enslave him for more than 6 years as a result of it. So his 6-year term as a slave will pay off all of the debts he owes you, no matter how big or how small. Number 3, you could freely become a permanent servant in someone's household rather than just a temporary one. That could only happen by your choice in exchange for room and board and pay. You cannot be involuntarily kept as a slave for more than 6 years. And if you voluntarily stay on as a servant permanently, they have to pay you with a place to live. They have to pay you with food to eat. They have to pay you with a kind of stipend you can use for spending money. They have to pay you with medical care, and on and on and on. Verses 5 and 6, it says, if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and then he shall take him as his permanent slave. Number 4, if your master seriously injures you, you are immediately set free, and your debt is immediately paid off in full. So if you begin a 6-year term, but 6 years into it, your master loses his temper, beats you into a bloody pulp, you are free now. Your debt is paid now, period. This is verses 26 and 27. It says, if a man strikes his servant's eye, he shall let him go for free for his eye's sake, and so on and so forth. Number 5, if your master fails to provide you with adequate room and board, you are immediately set free and your debt is immediately considered paid. This is verses 10 and 11. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, her marital rights. If he doesn't do these things for her, she may go free without paying any money. Now that is specifically talking about when you purchase a woman as a wife or a concubine or something like that, but that was also applied in the context of any sort of servant that you purchased. Number 6, if you are a slave and you fall in love with another slave, you can either buy their freedom or you can stay in servitude to be with her if you can't afford to buy her freedom. This is beginning in verse 3. It says, if he comes in married, that his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, he shall go out by himself, unless he either buys her freedom or stays a servant so that he can be with her. We'll see more of this a little later in some of the other codes. And number 7, more importantly than anything, it was illegal to force anyone into slavery. When we think of slavery today, we tend to think of what's called chattel slavery. I'm not actually sure if that's how you pronounce it, but we're thinking of the type of slavery practiced in America during the pre-Civil War days. That is not the type of slavery that the Bible is talking about here. The Mosaic Law did not permit chattel slavery. In chattel slavery, you go somewhere, you enslave someone, you bring them back to your country, and then you keep them as a slave for life, no matter what. Period. They have no rights, they have no defense, they have no anything. They have no hope. That's chattel slavery. The American brand of slavery was one of the most disgusting forms of slavery and servitude ever in the history of the world. One of, not the, but one of the worst. That was absolutely forbidden in the Mosaic Law. Verse 16 says, anyone who kidnaps someone and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. If you kidnap someone and force them into slavery, God will kill you. That was the law. Instead, within the law God gave to the Israelites, the only time you could ever experience permanent involuntary slavery was if you were a prisoner of war. If you were a member of the enemy army who was defeated by the Israelites, then you could be made into a permanent involuntary slave. At the same time, sometimes poor families would sell their daughters into slavery, but even in those cases, the Mosaic Law protects those poor daughters from abuse and neglect. This is beginning in verse 7. It says, if a man sells his daughter to be a female servant, the one who buys her must deal with her fairly. It says you must deal with her as a daughter or deal with her as a wife. You either have to treat her as a bride with all the same rights that a Hebrew wife would have, or treat her as a daughter with all the same rights that a Hebrew daughter would have. You cannot abuse her, you cannot neglect her, you cannot starve her, you cannot deprive her of money, you cannot deprive her of room and board, you cannot deprive her of food, you cannot deprive her of anything. At the same time, we see in the Mosaic Law, God is teaching the Israelites a little bit of what it looks like to dole out punishment in a fair way. The Mosaic Law institutes something called sanctuary laws. Sanctuary laws were meant to protect people from lynch mobs so that their cases could be judged fairly by a court. Beginning in verse 13, it says, I will appoint you a place where the fugitive may flee. In the same way, in the Mosaic Law, the Lord begins to teach the Israelites a little bit about the sanctity of human life, the inherent value of all human life. It's saying in verse 22, if men fight and hurt a pregnant woman so that she gives birth prematurely or miscarries, you shall, as the judge, determine. Causing someone to miscarry is punished by the law because human life is inherently valuable. And in exactly the same way, that is not just true of babies in the womb, that is also true of adults, even adults who have done something wrong, even adults who have wronged you that you then go out to avenge yourself against. Human life is treated as sacred through something called the lex talionis. Basically what this was doing was banning blood feuds, banning Hatfield and McCoy style family feuds. It was very common in the ancient Near East for someone to murder a man or accidentally kill a man, and then the rest of that murdered man's family come after not only the man who murdered him, but also the rest of that family. You'd say, you killed our brother, so we're going to wipe your entire family off the face of the earth. You killed our daughter, so we're going to wipe your entire bloodline from the face of the earth. That was called a blood feud, and it was unbelievably common in the ancient Near East. And yet, the Mosaic Law says, beginning in verse 23, if any harm follows, you must take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, and bruise for bruise. We hear that and we say, oh, that's brutal. If you crush somebody's eye, they're going to crush your eye. If you cut off somebody's hand, they're going to cut off your hand. That's a little much, isn't it? Well, no, actually. What it's saying is, if you injure someone's eye, the most they're allowed to do in response is injure your eye. If you injure someone's hand, the most they're allowed to do is injure your hand. If you kill someone, the most their family can do is kill the one who killed them. They cannot go after your whole family. They cannot go after everyone you love. No all-out blood feuds, no all wars as a result. Why? Because human life is sacred. The point of this is to protect human life. The death penalty in the Mosaic Law is not some horrifically harsh punishment where there should be some lighter punishment, The death penalty in the Mosaic Law is a radical reduction in the type of punishment that is allowed. Instead of torture, all you can do is the death penalty. Instead of wiping out their family, all you can do is put that one offender to death. This was about protecting human life because human life is sacred. And we see this same pattern continuing on as we trek into Exodus chapter 20. The Lord says, you have to create a culture that protects the vulnerable. That's the big picture of Exodus 22. Actually, that's the big picture of so much of the Mosaic Law. God tells his people to create a culture, create a system, create a nation that protects the vulnerable. We see this in a handful of different ways. I love beginning in verse 1, it says, if a man steals an ox or a sheep, he shall pay 5 oxen for 1 ox. What is happening here? What's happening is he's creating a set of laws that protect the livelihoods, the ownership, the dignity, the enfranchisement of the average person. If someone harms your crops or your land or your property or your animals, they have to make restitution to keep you from losing revenue or losing productivity. That's one example. Here's another example. He says, create a culture that protects women and families. It's beginning in verse 16. It says, if a man entices a virgin who is not pledged to be married and lies with her, he shall surely pay the dowry for her to be his wife. Now, we read that and we think, oh, that's a barbaric law. But actually, that would have been a very important law to protect women at the time. Why is it's important to understand that in the ancient world, they placed a very specific value on virginity. Why did they place that value on virginity? Because culturally in the ancient Near East, they wanted to ensure that the firstborn child, the heir in any family, was legitimately the heir of the family's patriarch. If a woman was seduced into sleeping with someone before she was actually married to someone, or if she was raped before she was married to someone, then she would be no longer a virgin, and it would be nearly impossible for her to be able to find a husband after that because they associated virginity with paternity. But the Mosaic law says that if you as a man either seduce a woman into sleeping with you or you rape her, you have to pay the virgin bride price for her so that she is not harmed or humiliated for no longer having her virginity for marriageability's sake. So you have to pay the price to marry her. You have to financially support her for the rest of your life and the rest of her life. She doesn't have to do anything for you. She does not have to move into your house. She does not have to sleep with you. She does not have to raise kids for you. She does not have to cook for you. She doesn't have to do anything for you. You have to fund her existence because you have closed off the avenue of marriage for her. In the same way, couples that have sex are required by the Mosaic law to get married so that their sexual urges will produce stable families instead of chaos and single parenthood and so on and so forth. We understand why today basically every study that is out there says exactly the same thing. Kids benefit significantly from having a stable, safe, loving, two-parent home with both a mother and a father. Now, if you are a single parent, that doesn't mean you can't raise kids who thrive. It just means you shouldn't have to be doing this alone. You deserve a safe, stable, loving partner to raise your child with you. Your child deserves a safe, stable, loving second parent to raise them alongside you. You shouldn't have to do it this. The fact that you are a single parent does not mean that you are bad. It doesn't even mean you did something wrong. Maybe you needed to get out of there. Maybe you needed to get rid of the other parent. I don't know your life. Nobody else does except you. But what this means is the goal, the target, what you deserve is to have a reliable partner in this. What the child deserves is to have a reliable second parent in this. The goal is safe, stable, loving families instead of the chaos that often comes when we have to carry the entire weight of raising a child on our one back. In kind of a similar vein, in the Mosaic law, abnormal sex acts like bestiality and others are punished by death, both because that creates major public health problems and because it's actually really important to protect the normativity of male-female, child-producing, stable family-producing sexuality. So verse 19, it says, whoever has sex with an animal shall surely be put to death. This is about creating a culture that protects both women in particular and families in general, to protect the family structure, to protect the normativity of male, female, child producing, stable family creating sexuality. That's number 2. Here's number 3. The Lord says, create a culture that protects foreigners and immigrants. I'm going to piss off a lot of people with this one, but I'm not the one you're mad at. Yahweh is the one you're mad at. Verse 21 says, you shall not wrong a foreigner or oppress him, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. In ancient pagan society, they saw foreigners as subhuman. But God's people must not. Now, that doesn't tell us almost anything about specifically what our country's immigration policy needs to be. The Bible doesn't have a thou shalt admit this many immigrants, this many refugees, this many whatever. What it does say, though, is that contempt for foreigners is satanic. And politicians that stoke contempt for foreigners are doing something satanic. They are teaching us to think back like the ancient pagans, that the Lord actively weaves the law of Moses to break us out of that mindset of. It's number 3. Number 4, the Lord says, create a culture that protects the poor and the powerless. Beginning in verse 22, it says, you shall not take advantage of any widow or fatherless child. Widows and orphans in particular had no legal rights in the ancient Near East. Men would often straight up not marry a non-virgin. Straight up would not raise a child that was some other man's child. They didn't care if your lack of virginity was from having been married before and then divorced, or having been married and then widowed, or having been raped at some point in the past. Culturally, they saw a non-virgin as pointless. They did not want to marry her. And they saw some other man's child, whether his father was dead, whether his father cut and run, whether it was something else entirely. They saw other people's children as competitors with their own bloodline, and often just straight up would not raise a child that was not their own. But the Mosaic Law protects widows and orphans from the cruelty of ancient Near Eastern culture. In the same way, it says create a culture that protects the poor and the powerless by banning something they call usury or predatory interest. In the ancient Near East, lenders had absolute power. If you were the lender, you had essentially absolute power over the person you lent money. And in the ancient Near East, the norm was that lenders would levy really impossible interest rates. So you would borrow this much money, and within a year, that debt has doubled. Within 2 years, it's quadrupled. Within 3 years, it's 8 times what you started with. Within 4 years, it's 16 times, and on and on and on and on. You would never be able to pay it back, and eventually what would happen was you would become enslaved. If you had one bad harvest, you would not be able to pay your debt. If you had one bad harvest, you could end up permanently enslaved for the rest of your life in ancient Near Eastern pagan society. God's people must lend out of brotherly love, not out of profiteering. It says, when you lend, it must not be a means of turning a profit. Verse 25 says, if you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be to him like a creditor. You shall not charge him interest. In the same way, another example comes in verse 26. It says, if you take your neighbor's garment as collateral, you shall restore it to him before the sun goes down. Often the poor had nothing but their cloaks to offer as collateral for a loan. Without that cloak, you would freeze to death at night. Therefore, you have to return a person's cloak at night. You cannot take it back until the morning. That's number 4. You create a culture that protects the poor and the powerless. Here's number 5. He says, create a culture that protects the authority structure that God created the universe with. This one is a little bit hard to wrap our heads around. But in ancient Near Eastern pagan society, they lived in constant chaos. The reason they lived in constant chaos is because there were constant coups. There were constant assassinations. There were constant usurpers seizing power from the existing rulers, the existing government, and so on and so forth. There was a constant power struggle all the time between different priestly classes, different ruling classes, different governing classes, different moneyed interests, and so on and so forth. It was the war of all against all, as the philosopher Thomas Hobbes liked to say, because there was zero respect for the authority structure. Rulers overruled, parents over children, teachers over students. It was just a constant scramble to become the ruler, become the powerful one, become the top of the ladder. But it says God's people must not play this game. God's people must not play the constant power struggle game. Instead, it says God's people must not even curse their leaders. He says, verse 28, you shall not blaspheme God, nor curse a ruler of your people. It says you shouldn't reject the authority of God himself. And in the same way, you shouldn't reject the authority of those whom God has placed in authority. It connects the authority of your rulers with the authority of the Lord. It connects the authority of your parents with the authority of God. It connects the authority of your teachers with the authority of the Lord, and on and on. Saying, create a culture that protects the authority structure God created the universe with. In exactly the same way, it says God's people must not reject God's authority by making offerings or sacrifices to other gods. God's people must not reject the Lord's authority by blaspheming him. God's people must not reject the Lord's authority by worshiping other gods. Instead, God's people must respect the Lord's authority by making offerings and sacrifices to him and him alone. Verse 20 and onward says, he who sacrifices to any god except Yahweh only shall be utterly destroyed. Protecting God's authority was so important that anyone who blasphemed him, anyone who served other gods, anyone who tries to pull the Israelites away from the authority of Yahweh and towards other false gods must be executed to prevent them influencing other people to do the same. Number 5. Here's number 6. He says, create a culture that protects the reality of truth versus falsehood. Beginning in verse 18, it says, you shall not allow a sorceress to live. As he who sacrifices to any god except to Yahweh only shall be utterly destroyed. What we have to understand is ancient pagan society had an entire roster of sorcerers, priests, cults, and more. And they were all competing against each other for the people's devotion. And as a result, it was impossible to get a solid grasp on what was true and what was not. What was right and what was wrong. What was real and what was fake. The line between truth and falsehood was basically meaningless in ancient pagan society. All that really mattered is who has power at this particular moment. Who's on top at this particular moment. Whoever was in charge at this particular moment, you have to follow them, whether they are right or whether they are telling the truth or lying. But it says God's people must not allow the line between truth and falsehood to blur. Instead, we have to protect the distinction between truth and falsehood. As God's people must not allow false religions, false gods to flourish among them. A sorcerer or a pagan priest, anyone who tries to draw people away from Yahweh must be executed. You must protect the distinction between true and false. That's number 6. And finally, number 7. It says you must create a culture that protects even animals. Exodus 22 verse 30 says, 7 days the newborn animal shall be with its mother, then on the 8th day you shall give it to me. What we have to understand is that in the ancient Near Eastern pagan religions and cultures, often animal torture was essentially a form of worship. They would actually worship their gods by inflicting pain, inflicting suffering on the sacrificial animals. Not always, not every pagan religion, not every single one. Don't misunderstand me, don't lump them all together, but it was a common thing in so many forms of ancient Near Eastern pagan religion. The Lord says, you do not worship me by torturing animals. He says animals are in our care as stewards. Remember Genesis 1 and 2. We were placed as stewards over creation, to care for creation, to love creation. It says even as we eat animals for food, still we are called to steward creation in a godly way by being kind to them. Even as we sacrifice animals, we are called to do that in a godly way by being kind to them. We slaughter the animals in the most painless way possible. We don't pull infant animals away from their mothers for at least 7 days. We let them have those 7 days first. We are respecting the bond between the baby animal and its mother. It may seem pointless, but it's not pointless. The point is that we reflect God's goodness and God's glory even by the way we treat animals that have been entrusted to us, even the ones we're going to eat, even the ones we're going to sacrifice. And that is all that we're going to have time for today. Exodus 21 and 22. I'll pick it up in Exodus 23 in the next video. But I know that there are plenty of questions you may have about all of this. So hit me up with whatever questions you have about Exodus 21 and 22, either in the comments on this video or in the Let's Read Scripture Together Facebook group, and I will tackle them as soon as I get the chance. And between now and then, I love you guys. Take care and keep reading. Hey, what's up? It's Pastor Ryan from Mount Zion Baptist Church. I'm extremely glad that you watched our video, and I hope that the Lord used it to speak to you in a very powerful and specific way. Hit the like and subscribe buttons on this video so that you can keep up with everything that we put out and we come up a little bit higher in your algorithm, and send a personal message to our YouTube account. I would love to hear from you, get to know you, pray with you a little bit. Between now and then, take care.